I want to start with something unsettling that you are carrying right now, in every cell of your body. Compared to almost any other animal spread across the planet, human beings are strangely, almost impossibly alike. Two chimpanzees from neighboring forests can differ more in their DNA than two people from opposite sides of the Earth. It is as if our entire species passed, not so long ago, through a doorway barely wide enough to let a few thousand of us through. For a long time, one answer to that riddle stood above all the others, and it was spectacular. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a supervolcano called Toba tore itself apart in the largest eruption our species has ever lived through. And the story goes that it very nearly finished us. I have to admit, I love that story. A single mountain almost erasing humanity. The trouble is, when people went looking for the proof, the evidence did something I did not expect. So let me introduce the accused properly, because one thing in this whole story has never once been in doubt. Around 74,000 years ago, on what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra, the crust tore open above a chamber of magma that had been swelling for hundreds of thousands of years. What climbed out of it was a VEI-8 event, the very top of the scale volcanologists use, the rank they keep in reserve for the single word, apocalyptic. Over something like 9 to 14 days, this supervolcano threw between 2,000 and 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the sky. I genuinely struggle to hold that figure steady in my head. Picture enough shattered rock to bury a small country roof deep, then fling it high enough to ride the winds clear across South Asia, where geologists in India still lift its faint gray signature out of the soil today. That signature even carries a name, the Younger Toba Tuff, and it shows up as a pale band in the ground more than 3,000 kilometers from the mountain that made it. The crater left behind is almost too large to read as a crater at all, a basin roughly 60 miles long and 20 across, the biggest of its kind known from the last several million years. Rain filled that hollow slowly over the centuries. We call the water Lake Toba now, a calm blue sheet some 50 miles long, and boats cross it every morning without anyone quite feeling the size of the wound beneath them. None of that is in dispute. This was one of the biggest eruptions the planet has produced while people walked on it. And it is the very event that would soon stand charged with nearly ending the human genetic line. Now, bring the clue and the mountain into the same room, because that is exactly what happened in 1998. An anthropologist named Stanley Ambrose looked at our strange genetic sameness on one side and at this enormous eruption on the other, and he drew a single clean line straight between them. His logic ran roughly like this. Geneticists had long noticed that humanity carries far less DNA variation than a species of our size and spread has any real right to. And one tidy way to explain a shortage of variety is a moment when the whole population briefly became very small. Ambrose handed that moment both a date and a cause. The blast, he argued, hurled so much sulfur and fine ash into the high atmosphere that it choked the incoming sunlight and triggered a volcanic winter lasting somewhere between 6 and 10 years, trailed by a deeper chill that dragged on for perhaps 1,000 more. Plants withered in the cold. Small bands of early humans, already thin on the ground and scattered, were squeezed down to something like 3,000 to 10,000 survivors across the entire world. A whole species you could have seated inside one modern stadium. That crash was the bottleneck. And the bottleneck was why we all look so eerily alike. I remember reading this the first time and feeling every piece lock into place. One mountain, one ruined decade, and the human story bent to within a whisker of ending. Told well, it read as clean and cinematic, and for years it was retold almost everywhere, as if it were long settled fact. I passed it along myself, once or twice, without ever asking who had actually gone back to check the ground. But a careful investigator does not marry the tidiest story in the room. You walk back out to the evidence. And the first place worth searching was the climate itself. If Toba had actually frozen the whole planet for a decade, that cold should have pressed its fingerprints into the ground everywhere. And above all, in East Africa, the very region where our ancestors were making their living at the time. So researchers went digging through the ancient lake beds and pollen records of the African Rift Valley, reading the buried layers for the deep, sustained chill the theory demanded. They did not find it. Down in the sediments of East Africa, there was no trace of a killing volcanic winter in the years after the eruption. Only a limited flicker of change in the plant life of the southern rift. We even have a modern yardstick for what a big eruption does to the sky. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1991, its sulfur veil cooled the entire planet by roughly half a degree for a year or two, then thinned and let the warmth back. Toba was vastly larger in volume, so the honest question was always how much larger it was in effect, and the records kept giving the same inconvenient answer. Ice cores drilled from Greenland caught the eruption's sulfur as a sharp spike, proof the event was genuinely vast. Yet, the cold that followed looked nothing like a decade of darkness. Climate models rebuilt with modern physics tended to fall in behind the dirt and the ice, producing coolings far gentler and far shorter than the frozen years the story leaned on. The ash itself was undeniable. The freeze that was supposed to do the actual killing simply refused to show up where it mattered most. In the ground beneath the people it was meant to have wiped away. By now the climate had given the theory almost nothing. So the trail ran on to a second and heavier line of evidence, one lying directly under the feet of archaeologists working in India. When Toba erupted, it dropped a distinct blanket of ash across the subcontinent, that same younger Toba tuff, a gray marker layer excavators can still dig straight down to. Here's the quietly devastating part. At a site called Jwalapuram in southern India, and at others further north, researchers pulled stone tools out of the earth below the ash, then pulled more of them out of the earth just above it, worked in much the same style by much the same kind of hands. Whoever had been shaping flint in those valleys before the supervolcano went off was, by every sign, still shaping flint in the same places once the sky had cleared. Human life did not halt at the ash line. Instead, it stepped straight across, as though the greatest eruption of the age had been an interruption rather than an ending. I keep circling back to that image, toolkits sitting patiently on both sides of the gray band, because it is such a stubborn, ordinary kind of proof. One review of the record put the point about as plainly as science ever manages. Many forms of life survived the super eruption, a sentence that sits very awkwardly beside a tale of mass death and a species dragged to the brink of vanishing. If the winter had really been as savage as advertised, those upper tools should never have existed at all. Widen the lens beyond those two Indian valleys, and the same pattern holds. Forests that were supposed to have been scorched into silence turn up again in the pollen record, recovering on timescales that look almost casual next to the apocalypse we had imagined. Animals that a true multi-year winter should have thinned or erased were, on the whole, still present when the dust settled. None of this pretends the eruption went unnoticed by the living world, since a sky choked with ash is never a small thing to sit beneath. What it says is that life, ours very much included, is a great deal harder to switch off than one dramatic number makes it sound. And every fresh excavation has tended to nudge the story that way instead of back toward the catastrophe we started with. So where does all of this leave the case against the mountain? The eruption is not the thing on trial. It happened, it was colossal, and nobody serious disputes that part now. What the evidence has been quietly taking apart is the sentence that came after the eruption. The claim that this one blast starved the world and drove our kind to the very edge of extinction. That long executioner's winter looks, under real scrutiny, far weaker than it was sold as. Perhaps regional, perhaps short-lived, perhaps both. Those people who were supposed to have nearly died out instead left their toolkits lying calmly on both sides of the ash. Genetics that once seemed to point straight at the mountain turned out to fit a dozen other timelines just as comfortably. Layer by layer, the dramatic version comes apart in your hands. Toba, if we stay honest with what the ground actually shows us, is not guilty as charged. It stays a genuine monster of an eruption that has been handed a crime it does not appear to have committed. And I have come to feel that this distinction matters far more than I first assumed. I do want to be careful here, because it would be easy to swing too hard the other way. Saying the bottleneck story is shaky is not the same as saying the eruption was gentle, and it never means the years after it were kind. Somewhere under that ash there were real winters, failed seasons, and people who had a far harder time of it than they deserved. What the evidence rejects is only the grand version, the idea of a single planet-wide freeze that swept to within a few thousand lives of ending us. Hardship is not the same thing as near extinction, and a bad decade in one region is not the same as the world going out like a lamp. A community can grieve a terrible season and still be there, unbroken, a generation later. And that ordinary resilience is exactly what the ash layers keep recording. The science did not prove that Toba was harmless. It proved that our species is tougher and more widely scattered than the neat catastrophe allowed for. There is a quieter lesson buried in how long the beautiful version lasted. It survived in textbooks and documentaries for years, not because the evidence for it kept getting stronger, but because it was such a satisfying shape for a story to take. A clear villain, a single terrible night, a species saved by a hair. I understand the pull of that completely, since I fell for it too, and part of why this case stays with me is watching the slower, less cinematic work of ash layers and pollen counts and stone tools quietly outvote the drama. That is science correcting itself in real time, and it is not loud about it. None of this makes the mountain less interesting to me. If anything, it makes Toba more human-sized, a real event with real limits, not a myth carrying a body count. Enormous things happen in the world and they matter, and yet they do not always bend the whole future to their will. That gap between how vast an event looks and how much it actually reshaped the world turns out to be the quiet subject underneath this whole investigation, and it is the part I keep turning over long after the numbers have faded. Yet the original clue has not gone anywhere, and that is precisely what keeps the whole mystery alive for me. Strip Toba out of the picture completely, and we are still standing over the strange fact we opened with: a species scattered across every continent that carries suspiciously little genetic variety, as though we really did squeeze through some narrow door not very long ago. Something did thin our numbers or hold them low for a long stretch, somewhere back in the deep past. Perhaps it was a slow demographic squeeze instead of a single catastrophe. A long, great chapter when our ancestors were simply few and thinly spread across a hard and shifting world. Maybe it was an older bottleneck entirely, one that closed its door long before Toba ever stirred. It could just as easily have been several smaller pinches, none of them dramatic on its own, that together left the mark we read in ourselves today. There is even a chance the narrow passage has less to do with a disaster and more to do with how few of us there ever were, back when our whole lineage was a scattering of small groups edging out of Africa into a wider world. A species that starts modest and stays modest for a long time will carry the same low-variety signature as one that was nearly destroyed. And telling those two histories apart from DNA alone is genuinely hard. Honestly, nobody yet knows which reading is right, and I have made a quiet kind of peace with that uncertainty. The clue in the blood is real. The neat, single-cause answer is the part that failed the test. So where does that leave us? Standing in the ash of a story that no longer quite holds. Toba was real. That part never wavered. The largest eruption our kind has ever witnessed genuinely happened, and the sky over half the world genuinely went dark with its ash. What did not survive the evidence was the ending we wanted. The single mountain that almost erased us. The tidy near extinction with a clear villain. The clue in our blood is still there, still real, still strange. We really are a species that came through some kind of narrow door. We just no longer get to say, with a straight face, that we know exactly which door, or exactly when it closed behind us. And I've come to think that is the more honest kind of awe. Not the thrill of a catastrophe that nearly ended us, but the stranger feeling of standing over a genuine mystery and admitting, out loud, that the beautiful answer was probably wrong. The mountain is innocent, or at least not guilty as charged, and somewhere in that unfinished sentence is the real story of how we got here.